Welcome to Analyst Talk with Jason Elder. It's like coffee with an analyst, but there's no actual coffee. Each episode, we interviewed an expert in the field of law enforcement analysis to share their career-defining stories and to get their insights on the world. Please join us on recognizing and learning from these brilliant minds as we define the law enforcement analysis profession one episode at a time.
Thank you for joining me. I hope many aspects of your life are progressing. My name is Jason Elder, and today our guest has 25 years of law enforcement analyst experience. He's an analyst, he's an instructor, he's an author, professor, and presenter. He's had over 15 years on the executive IACA board. If you've been listening to this podcast, his name's been dropped in nearly half the episodes so far. In fact, if IACA had a Mount Rushmore, his face would be one of the four on the monument. Please welcome the one and only Christopher Bruce. Christopher, how are we doing?
Pretty good, Jason. Thank you very much. That's quite an introduction. Glad to be here. I'm a big fan of your work so far on these podcasts.
All right, thank you. There was a lot of pressure there. I wasn't exactly sure. There was so much to go over. I wanted to do you justice, so I hope I did.
That's awfully, yes, more than enough.
So let's go back in time. Take us back to when it all started, Cambridge PD, 1997, when you first become a crime analyst.
It started a little bit earlier than that, actually, because I was an intern at the Cambridge Police Department before I was an analyst. And this was happening while I was at Northeastern University in Boston studying criminal justice. Like most people who go into that major, even through today, as far as I can tell, I was totally unaware of the crime analysis field. I wanted to be a police officer at the time. Later, I think I switched to pre-law for a while, but Cambridge was well known as offering well-paying internships at the time, and I wanted to be an intern in the detective unit, so I applied for that. They filled that, and they offered me crime analysis instead, and I didn't know much about it, but when I heard what it was about, I thought it sounded interesting, so I took the job, and it wasn't more than, 3 months, I think, working there as an intern before I realized that it was what I wanted to do, and it was the profession I had been waiting for. So I worked there as an intern all throughout the rest of college and immediately got a full-time job there after I graduated and stayed there till 2001. I had the fortune of learning crime analysis from Richard Severi, who, if his name hasn't been dropped so far on this podcast, it really should have been. He's still working as a crime analyst. He's celebrating around 40 years in the field, more, I think, I guess maybe 43 by now. And he's been at the same agency most of this time. So he has a wealth of knowledge of Cambridge specifically, but also about crime analysis. And he was just a really fantastic person to learn from. His approach, you have to understand, remember back then, the desktop computing revolution hadn't taken over yet. Not every desktop had a computer. We didn't have GIS. We had Microsoft Office, but we didn't really know how to use it yet. And so I'm starting in this era when it's still very much a qualitative profession, and you find out information by talking to officers and by going out into the community and by reading documents that you have to sort of mentally collate because we don't have the computer techniques yet. And so it was very qualitative. It was like being a good reporter. And actually, Rich had started his career as a reporter, so it worked out well for him. And when you were writing a story about a pattern, it was like you were like banging out copy for a good newspaper article, and you had to answer all the who, what, when, where, how, and why, and you had to know your beat. You had to chase down leads. And so it was a very different way of doing crime analysis than the more intensely technical approach that we take today. And while I eventually got good at that, I think, I probably take more naturally to the technical approach. I'm glad I got to learn it in that era because it really instilled with me an importance for making those connections with other people that you're working with, making those connections with your jurisdiction, and reading your crime reports, most importantly, on a day-to-day basis.
That seems like such a change from what you hear today.
Oh, yeah.
A lot of it you hear today, or even when I was an analyst in the early 2000s, ComStat came about and kind of swept over the profession. And
ComStat, and just GIS in general, the GIS revolution and the advent of modern relational databases. And I don't think it should be otherwise. I mean, a good analyst today has got to have that technical skill. But I do think there are things that are worth retaining from that early era, and definitely engaging with those reports and reading them and not just relying on the structured data set that you have at your disposal is one of those things.
And when I had Mark Stallo on, his words to the world were actually get out of the office and go to the area that you are analyzing.
Absolutely.
You can't get everything from a computer.
No, not at all, right? And more so than ever, right? So, nowadays you can, if you want to look at an environment, you can go on Google Street View. And I mean, heck, there are some places you can even zoom right into the businesses and sort of walk into them. So it's more so than ever you can use technology. But sure, I still believe in that. I mean, when you've got to get out into the community, you've got to meet people, go on ride-alongs, go to community meetings. I'm a big fan of when your work is going to be used to do some sort of operation, stakeout, tailing somebody, whatever it is, go out there with the officers and detectives who are going to do those things and see what the realities of police work. I mean, it really informs your approach to crime analysis, I think, when you have that experience.
I would even encourage people to do that volunteering on their own time if your manager won't let you do that during business hours.
Yeah, and there are lots of ways you can kind of work, those types of visits into. I used to, for instance, on the way to and from work, just driving home and driving to work in the morning, take slightly different routes and drive down streets that I hadn't otherwise visited or stop by a hot spot just so I could check it out. And I thought that made a difference. It meant when a crime happened on that street, I was more likely I could visualize the area, and having that environmental context often makes a big difference.
Yes. So I guess what made you leave Cambridge for Danvers PD?
I made a dumb mistake while I was at Cambridge. I don't remember my thinking at the time. I guess I just wanted to make more money. Frankly, I can't think of anything else I can attribute it to. The job of information systems manager came up, and I took it. And it wasn't what I wanted to do. And I had just been elected to the IACA Board. Mm-hmm. I had just been elected to MACA, the Mass Association of Crime Analysts, as president. And so to take a job that would sort of take me away from crime analysis was really kind of stupid. But I did. I took it. I guess I thought the agency would just give me the flexibility to remain involved. And I was still working in the same unit, so it kind of felt that I was still connected. But it wasn't for me. I wasn't a good information systems manager. I think it's 20 years later, and I think they're still blaming things that don't work on me. So the Danvers job came up about after I'd been doing it for less than a year. I knew the guy that was going to be my supervisor. He'd been a member of MACA and had come to a lot of meetings. His name was John Tiplety, and really great, a great guy. And I knew that I'd enjoy working for him. And as we talked, it became clear that at Danvers, they would give me the flexibility to do what I really wanted to do, which was increase my involvement in professional associations and to increase the training that I did. So it was a no-brainer.
So at Danvers then, what were your tasks or what kind of projects did you get into?
Well, I was the only analyst there, so I did a little bit of everything, any type of analytical work that needed to be done. It was a small community. The population was only about 25,000. It had a lot of commercial presence that made the crime statistics higher than you would expect based on that population figure, but it still wasn't terribly busy. So I was able to do a bit of intelligence analysis, a bit of tactical, strategic, lots of administrative analysis, because that's what my chief ultimately really prized, I think. It gave me the chance to not only read every crime report, but I could actually read every CAD call that came in. So I did some coding on just about any type of it. In fact, I didn't even make a distinction in my data set between the two. Everything was an incident and got pooled in an incident database. So I liked that level of knowing what was going on and that level of detail I was able to work in. It was, a little bit. I was there a long time for an agency that didn't need somebody with I don't mean to sound arrogant saying this, but somebody of my qualifications. I mean, it didn't have enough happening at the time. So that's really when I started to branch out more into consulting and training, just so I could get some satisfaction from working with other agencies and larger agencies around the country and around the world.
But because it was so small, I think one of the great advantages of working for a small community is you get a chance to read everything.
Yeah.
And know everything. You mentioned getting into CAD calls and reading all the crime reports. I mean, you knew the town.
That's absolutely true. That and even today, it's been 10 years since I left, but I still can remember where all the streets are and still get news alerts from the agency and stuff, and I find what's going on, and I still feel pretty connected to it despite not having been there in a long time. Of course, it helps that a good friend of mine took my place, and she's been there ever since. So that continuity has been there. But another good thing about working for a small agency was just that they didn't have a large agency's obsession with the idea of chain of command, of any distinction really between civilians and officers. It was much more of a friendly, collegial atmosphere around the place. And I could talk to anybody. I didn't have to go through my supervisor to do something, and I didn't have to ask all kinds of permissions to do what I wanted to do. And I really don't thrive very well in environments that are overly micromanaged. So it was a perfect place for me for a long time.
Sounds like you were part of the team.
Yeah, I really did feel so. Yeah.
Who replaced you?
Her name is Sarah Slavin.
Okay. Yeah. Okay.
And she just, I think it was a few months ago, she crossed the line where she's now been there longer than I was there.
Then you go into consulting. So what made you take the leap to leave Danvers and go into consulting?
It was a little bit unfair to my chief, I have to say. He told me no, essentially, for the first time, and about something that I wanted to do, something I'd already promised the people that I would do. And it was a training that I had promised to give. And by that time, they were giving me time off without pay that exceeded, my vacation time to go and do these trips. And I probably had been gone already, 8 or 9 weeks the year. So I told him, I probably told him the week ahead of time, I want to go to Washington next week and do this class. And he finally said, look, we can't even justify having this position here if you keep taking off. And so I quit that day.
Oh,
so
wow.
Yeah. And we all worked it out that I stayed a little bit longer. But I was kind of a jerk, I think, in retrospect. And we have a good relationship now, so there's no hard feelings. But he was incredibly flexible with me for a lot of years. And the moment I encountered any inflexibility, I bailed on him, which was very nice. But it worked out for me. I enjoyed my 10 years of self-employment. I worked on some contracts that I really believed in, developed my skills a lot more than I would have developed them continuing to stay at that agency. So it was best all around.
What obstacles did you run into with starting out as a consultant?
Well, I never solved them, to be honest. So it was the same obstacles that I had all the way through the end of being a consultant. For anybody who's thinking about doing such a thing, you need to be aware you need to make like 3-4 times your regular hourly rate at consulting in order to break even with whatever you were making before. When you consider the fact that you've got to now pay for your own health insurance and a lot of maybe travel and your own equipment, plus every hour has got to be billable now. So you can't have a bad day where you just phone it in and you still get paid 8 hours. You've got to be able to justify, all the hours that you're billing with actual product. So and I'm just not good at that. I'm not good at self-motivating work. I mean, I had way more contract offers and in the ones I took, way more potentially billable hours than I ever billed for and gigs than I ever took. I could have done a lot better for myself, but I just didn't have the ability to be that motivated. So I didn't thrive very well, at least financially as a consultant. There were times that I took on projects that I probably shouldn't have because they just didn't fit my personality all that well. To not be so pessimistic about it, there are things that I really did enjoy. And very early on, one of my primary contracts became the DDACTS program, Data-Driven Approaches to Crime and Traffic Safety, which was a cooperation. It was mostly managed by the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, but it was nominally a cooperation between them and the National Institute of Justice and the Bureau of Justice Assistance. And I think probably most people are familiar with it, but it was the idea was that we can reduce traffic collisions and crime at the same time by deploying officers effectively at hotspots for both, or at least where they're fairly near each other. And we can use traffic stops as a mechanism of crime control because most offenders in most places are traveling by vehicle. So it has a suppressive effect on crime in the area when you use traffic stops as a tool. It was really just hotspot policing. I mean, it's the same thing we've been hearing for years worked and has been studied over and over. But this was the first time that we saw the federal government funding a series of workshops, first of all. So DDACTS took the form of workshops held across the country in which analysts and commanders and supervisors attended and were trained by analysts, commanders, and supervisors from agencies that had successfully implemented the model. And they developed their own action plans for how they were going to do it. I've never seen training like this where analysts attend the training with their executives and with maybe a sergeant or lieutenant from the agency, and they all get the same training. So that was a special part of the project. A lot of agencies came to the workshops feeling not understanding about analysis. Maybe they didn't have analysts, and then they left convinced that they had to go and hire somebody. And we saw a lot of people get employed across the country, I think, because of the DDACTS model. So I would love to see that same model applied to a bunch of other things, like focused deterrence programs, for instance. Those are provingly increasingly successful. We should have a cadre of experts on that who go around the country offering workshops, helping agencies create their own plan for developing those things and going back and implementing them. So it was a very well-run program. I suppose you're big on name drops, so I have to recognize Deborah Peel, who preceded me. She joined the program before I did and really set up the structure of how the workshops worked. And then helped bring me on board when I was available. I know I'm going to look back on that era from roughly 2011 to 2015 when DDACTS was at the height of its funding and its activities is probably some of the best of my life. I got to travel a lot. I got to work with so many analysts and agencies around the country. And then a year later, I'd hear, oh yeah, we implemented this model and crime went down, dropped 20%. We dropped 15% in these different types of crimes. And that was extremely rewarding. So that was probably my primary contract for a long time. I also had a contract with BJA through IACA to train law enforcement executives on how to set up effective crime analysis units. And we did that. I sort of adopted the DDACTS model for that, and we did workshops around the country for that for a few years. I had a contract, I still do, with the Massachusetts Gaming Commission to analyze the effects of casinos on the surrounding communities in Massachusetts. And that really calls, I think, my top strengths as a consultant, which are interpreting different police data systems, getting the data out of them, and making something effective with them. So that was a lot of fun. I did work through ISATAP, International Criminal Investigation. Oh, shoot. I always screw up the acronym. So it's a Department of Justice program that basically teaches our allies around the world different techniques. And I worked in Ukraine with them. I worked under a contract with Transport for London for a while. I worked in Trinidad and Tobago helping set up their crime and problem analysis branch. So I never had one, dominant full-time gig. It was just always assembling together a living through a piecemeal group of contracts. And there were times that, I didn't have much to bill from month to month. And there were times that I had a lot, and I guess I didn't mind that so much, but I did ultimately, I think, bite off more than I could chew. It's really tough to, I don't know how to say it. It's tough to moderate your work when you're a consultant, when you're employed full time. It's hard to say yes to something and then know exactly how that's going to affect the coming months. And I'm glad in some ways I'm out of it for that reason.
Yeah. So in terms of DDACTS, what do you think are the major misconceptions about DDACTS?
Well, I think that a lot of people, they overstress the literal overlap in hotspots between crime and traffic collisions, and they think, well, we don't have that, and so there's no point in implementing that here. And that was always sort of the most facile way to implement the program. Really, it was about mapping both and then just thinking intelligently about, where they lie and how you can implement the right sort of strategy. And we always said that if you don't have much of a problem with crime or don't have much of a problem with collisions, or you don't find that the hotspots are anywhere near each other, then that's fine. Focus on one or the other. But it was about hotspot policing. And there are people that, I guess I've seen some people say that it doesn't work, but hotspot policing has been shown to work over and over again, and that's what DDACTS is. So if it doesn't work, it doesn't work because the agency didn't really fully engage it. I've heard it say that it's just about traffic enforcement, but it's not. We always encouraged at the workshops that agencies engage in problem-oriented policing and try to solve the underlying issues that they saw at those hotspots. We always encouraged, it's one of the DDACTS guiding principles that agencies engage with the community and form partnerships with the community, and you get their buy-in before doing any extra enforcement in those neighborhoods. So I think those are probably the primary misconceptions. I guess a lot of analysts saw it and thought, well, how that's not any different than what we're already doing. And that might be true for a lot of agencies, although we encouraged a level of evaluation that I don't think is happening in most places that implement it. And I guess just overall, what I liked most about it, it was a program that drew directly from the analyst. So it wasn't like so many other things that we do in crime analysis where we push out information in bulletins or reports or maps, and we just hope somebody is going to take it and use it. DDACTS ensured that it was absolutely going to be used for effective allocation of patrol. And I'd like to see more programs like that in police departments. Unfortunately, I'm no longer associated with it at all. We parted ways earlier this year, and I'd be surprised if it really continues, partly because COVID has made it impossible to do face-to-face workshops, and so that's going to be a major blow, but also partly because the Black Lives Matter movement, which I would like to make absolutely clear that I fully sympathize with and am generally in supportive of, but as an offshoot of it, the idea of doing extra patrols in bad neighborhoods where there's a lot of crime seems to be under attack these days. And so it's a hard sell to go out there and say, we think you should use traffic enforcement within crime hotspots as a technique for reducing crime. Because I think agencies are starting to back away from the idea of proactively going out there and making contacts and doing specialized enforcement in general, which is a huge cornerstone of everything we do as crime analysts. So it's going to be tough to navigate around those waters.
Do you have an example where you implemented DDACTS and you really saw a significant decrease in crime?
Oh, yeah. There are plenty of agencies. I mean, I don't personally have the data because I was always me teaching and consulting with agencies that did it. But yeah, lots of agencies out there that had success with it. Nashville, Tennessee, Baltimore County, Maryland early on. A number of agencies in Texas. In fact, Texas still has the most probably active approach to DDACTS, and quite a few in New Jersey. I could provide anybody with a list of the ones that I know about, and the people that are still involved would be able to provide more. It was fairly rare to see a sustained commitment to it. So even agencies that had notable reductions from during the implementation period would very often a year later not be doing it anymore. And for no particular reason except that it's hard to sustain interest in certain things. And officers, I suppose, never really liked it because they were being told to go do something in between their calls for service, which they had always regarded as their own time instead of time that they needed to do something proactive for the community. So there are plenty of places that tried it and worked and they still haven't continued, but that's no different than a lot of other things we see, like problem-oriented policing or intelligence-led policing, where for a while it works and then the next chief comes along and for some reason they stop doing it.
All right, well, let's take a break. When we come back, I'd like to get into IACA, what we're seeing now and where you see it going, and talk a little bit maybe about your advice to analysts for today. So,
absolutely.
You're listening to Analysts Talk with Jason Elder. We'll be right back.
Hey everyone, it's Mindy from Analyst Talk with Jason Elder. Jason and I are happy to announce a new limited podcast series called Sean Bear's Guide to Hiring a Law Enforcement Analyst. In this series, Jason and Sean talk about different steps of the hiring process from both the standpoint of the hiring manager and the job seeker. As someone who recently got a new job during the production of the series, this really resonated with me. I learned a lot from this guide, and it validated a lot of little practices I normally do, like bringing a portfolio or sending a thank you letter after the interview. Little things I thought didn't make that much of a difference, but could really give you an advantage over the competition. I think this guide provides great insights into the hiring world, and Sean is so passionate about making sure that both parties are happy and benefit from the results. Obviously, this series was designed with hiring a quality analyst in mind, but I think the lessons can be utilized for other professions as well. The series will be published in its entirety on Wednesday, August 26th. Don't forget to check out our other projects on our website at www.leapodcast.com. Thanks!
Welcome back. Before the break, we were talking to Christopher Bruce about DDACTS and his career influencing the profession. Last year, you became an assistant professor. So is that kind of sunk in now?
Yeah, I had been teaching adjunct classes at various universities going all the way back to 2001. I taught at Suffolk University in Boston, UMass Lowell, Westfield State in Massachusetts, Tiffin University in Ohio, Western Oregon University. So I've been doing this for a while, but I kind of put myself in a bad situation because in 2015 I was living in New Hampshire, and we had a really bad winter in New England that year, and there was snow practically every day, and my house ended up getting destroyed essentially. And so we took the insurance settlement, but we sold it. And around the same time, my wife got a job that allowed her to work from home, working for a database company. And so we realized we could move anywhere, and we'd always wanted to move to Maine, and I was still on the road all the time, so it worked out. So we moved up here and close to Acadia National Park in Maine. And it worked out for a while, but I started getting sick of the road all the time and never being home, because I really like it here in Maine. So I started looking for jobs, and really there's nothing for a crime analyst in the state, really. There's only 3, I think, that are full-time employed. Bangor doesn't have one. If they did, I would have been first to apply for that one. They don't have a position, and I wasn't able to convince them. So when I saw a job posting for Husson University, I decided to give it a shot, and I got hired. And it's a good university. I don't think most people have ever heard of it. It's not Hudson, it's Husson, Husson, and it's in Bangor. I think it's, I'm not overselling it to say it's the best criminal justice program in Maine, but of course we don't have a lot in Maine. But it's a small faculty. There's only about 8 of us that work in the School of Legal Studies, which includes the criminal justice program. We have about 100 total students in that school, but I really enjoy it. It's a great campus. It's been a great group of people to work with, and the only thing that's just been a fly in the ointment is that COVID started in the middle of my first year, and so instead of getting to teach in person, which is really what I wanted to do when I took the job, we've had to do so much online, and we don't have the depth of interaction. But of course, that's affecting everybody, and I'm not unique in that regard. So I don't know. I think I'm kind of at a decision point right now. I'm trying to decide whether my future is in education and being a criminal justice professor, or whether I try to maintain a connection to crime analysis, or a strong connection. I'll maintain some no matter what, but whether it's a particularly strong connection and I start to pursue more contract opportunities again, I haven't decided.
What would you recommend to aspiring analysts to study or to learn more about?
Oh, I don't think that the traditional route of criminal justice or criminology is necessarily a bad idea. It's important that you have a healthy understanding of what makes somebody criminal. How criminals are born, and how they're shaped by their environments and so forth. And it's important to have a healthy understanding of police science and police operations as you get into it. But I do think that the highly technical nature of our field isn't necessarily being met by the educational systems of today. And we should probably invest more in bachelor and master's level statistics and GIS training and other types of computer application use, people who are seeking to enter the field. One thing I always tell students who are considering a career in crime analysis is, although it's an old profession, it is not a profession in which every good idea has already been decided. It's not a profession that has already codified all of the best techniques. There is room for anybody who gets in this field to be a pioneer in a particular area of a technical area or a more substantive area, and to become an expert in some particular part of crime analysis, and to have their name attached to it for maybe potentially generations beyond this one. It just takes somebody with a little extra time and a strong will to develop something new in this field. But there's a lot to still be developed.
They could get their face on the IACA Mount Rushmore, right?
They absolutely could.
So, for seasoned analysts, what would you recommend to them?
Well, much of the same thing. I think there's a tendency to get a job, to settle into the job, and really not develop any further, I suppose, after you start working. And it's too bad. There are exceptions, of course, and I'm always glad to see those exceptions. But I think the norm is for people to basically have the same skill set 10 years on that they had when they first started, maybe with some things that are particular to their agency that they've worked on, or particular technology their agency implements. But I've been going to IACA conferences for 20 years now, and I've been training analysts during that time. And I think it's much more common that I encounter the same analysts repeatedly who have never implemented the things they've learned at the conferences than it is to find somebody who's gone home and kicked it up to a new level after every conference. I would put myself, in that group, at least partially too. So I don't know what it takes, what we have to do in order to instill this profession with a greater drive towards continued professional development. But it's keeping us at a very basic level in some areas, and I'm disappointed to see that. But there are people out there who still have to write on Post-it notes, new minus old divided by old, on their cubicle wall to remind themselves how to do percentage change. And we should be well into linear regression analysis for figuring out what next year's crime numbers ought to look like. So I guess that's what I would say. We need to carve out time and have a good plan for that time as to how to continually improve and engage in professional development.
Yes, I think I would add a lot of analysts have difficulty explaining the statistics to management. That's why it has such a difficult time expanding in police departments.
There's that too, absolutely, right? Yeah, we have an audience we have to reach, and if they don't understand what we're talking about, then our, any statistics that we introduce aren't any good. But yeah, still, there's a lot to be gained from statistics in this field. And I was just the funny thing is this topic came up today when I was teaching a computer applications and crime analysis class online. We were talking about statistics, and I said then, and I still believe this, there's a place for a book called Statistics and Crime Analysis that we all internalize, and that moves everybody to a new level in their understanding of trend analysis and forecasting and predictive analysis. I don't know who's going to write it. I'd certainly be happy to, but I'm not qualified. I'd have to spend years learning the material myself to write the book. But we need that book in this field.
Yeah, those that are listening, if you know somebody that can help Christopher out with the book, email leapodcasts@gmail.com and we'll get you set up. So I guess just going the span of your career, we started with back in the late 90s and quickly moved up till today. What have you seen that maybe was an issue back then but is no longer now, or maybe an issue that, geez, we had that issue in the 90s and we still have it today?
It's cyclical in a lot of ways. So I got kind of depressed at the state of the crime analysis field during the 10 years that I was doing my technical assistance self-employment, because I was routinely going around to agencies all over the country that had crime analysis programs, that had crime analysts, and finding that they weren't doing even the basic things that we would have thought every analyst did back in the 1990s or early 2000s. There was a time in the 1990s that I actually thought that GIS was becoming too important, and that this drive towards crime mapping was overwhelming everything else that crime analysts did. And I think I even wrote a couple. There's probably still find an article or so that I wrote on the subject, or an essay, I suppose would be a better way to say it. Back then, I thought it was terrible that the NIJ had started a crime mapping program, but not a crime analysis program. And I know Noah Fritz agreed with me, and he sort of renamed it when he was in charge of that training. But that during that time, I worried that we'd all just become GIS people and lose all the rest of crime analysis. Well, I'm happy to say I was wrong about that, but now I'm facing the opposite problem, where I'm trying to convince analysts they need to actually have a GIS program. They instead, I don't know, they're trying to get by with Google Maps or with something internal that came with the records management systems that may put dots on the map but doesn't do anything else that a proper GIS does. And so it's kind of funny that I go out there and I have to make these same old arguments that I would have thought would be completely obsolete by now. I think the same thing is true with when it comes to, say, data management in crime analysis. Back when I started, it was just a given that you were going to take some responsibility for managing your own data set. Of course, we didn't even have ODBC or anything like that back then, but, we might have matrices, paper matrices, and then ultimately that evolved into Excel sheets or Access databases that we created ourselves. But however the data got into those, it was our responsibility, we thought, as analysts, to check the quality and control for that, and to do some of our own coding of the crimes that were reported to the agency, code MO variables, subcategorize them, things like that. And I run into, again, analysts today who not only don't do any of that, but they don't even have a direct connection to their source data. And they're doing their work clumsily out of the records management system. And basically, they can't answer most of the questions that their command staff comes to them asking for help with. It's just been very frustrating as a consultant trying to advocate for that, and then just seeing those sorts of things not implemented. And maybe I'm the one that's out of touch, and software really is doing all of that for us. But then I have to wonder, where's the analyst's role if we're all relying on customized crime analysis and crime mapping software? So no, not enough has changed, I would say. The things that we had to sell, that we had to advocate for 20 years ago are still quite relevant, I think.
I think that's interesting because when I think of an RMS, a good RMS should relieve the analyst of the reporting role. So people coming to them with all these requests for reports.
Oh, I see what you're saying.
Then they should be able to go to the records management system and answer a lot of the basic questions, whether it's a report or a dashboard or something. The analyst should be getting all the data on the back end.
Exactly. Yeah. The RMS system is not for the analyst, and half of the things that is sold as crime analysis software is not for the analyst. Software that puts the dots in the map and color codes them and makes them look nice. That's for everybody else to use, so they don't have to bother you. You need to use a real GIS system to do your mapping, so that you can go a level above that and properly analyze hotspots and do spatial joins and the other things that a full GIS actually does.
I interviewed Sean Fisher last week from Omaha. She came in as a geographer.
Yeah.
Right. And so we were talking about animal movements from I want to say in the early 2000s, where we, just kind of took that whole thing over. And to me, to go from that interview last week where we were reminiscing about the different points, and she really got technical in some of the geography, which I was really impressed by. To now talk to you this week to say that there's a lot of departments that don't even have ArcGIS is just astonishing.
Oh, it is. It's nuts. And if I had lasted longer in self-employment, there was a lot more stuff I wanted to do in terms of writing books. ArcGIS is not in any way prohibitively expensive, I don't think, given what other things agencies spend money on. But because I had so much trouble getting agencies to buy it, I really always wanted to write a book on QGIS that demonstrated common analytical techniques. That's a free GIS program, open source, that you can get so that analysts wouldn't have the excuse not to have a GIS based on cost. So I had a lot of book ideas that probably are never going to happen now that I'm no longer in it day to day. But again, there's another thing. Somebody should write that, and remove the excuse for not having the software.
And then so much is done online with ArcGIS. too.
Well, yeah, and that's an area where it's a weaker area for me, and I'm not necessarily convinced we're seeing a lot of movement, so of course, to online platforms, software as a service, and cloud-based hosting for data, and I'm not sure it's a good trend. There are things that you simply can't accomplish with a browser-based application, and rather than solve those issues, I think a lot of people are just learning to live without them. I think it's too bad. We don't want to go backwards, right? And yet we see it, like your example of the animal movement extension is a perfect one. We were just on the cusp of using that effectively when it wasn't available anymore, essentially. And look at CrimeStat, that wonderful spatial statistics application that Ned Levine created. It was never really fully implemented by the crime analysis community, and now it's basically gone. I mean, it's still out there. You can download it, but it uses old conventions and old file types, and I don't think anybody's going to pick it up now. So we're going to lose that resource before it fully became available to us. Although I just found out today that finally ArcGIS Pro introduced the ability to do an OLE database connection to access databases, which is something that I was bemoaning the loss of for a long time. But until they announced that was an example too. I was finally getting somewhere with a lot of analysts, encouraging them to directly link their databases with their GIS applications and stop having to geocode all the time by using a coordinate library. And just as I felt I was getting there, suddenly ArcGIS removed the ability to do the type of data connection. So it just feels like for every step forward, sometimes we're taking a step backwards.
Talking about the online GIS, the same thing with the RMS, right?
Yeah,
You're only going to be able to use what's in front of the curtain. You're not going to be able to see all what's behind the curtain. So it's kind of the same thing.
You know me. I mean, I'm always pontificating about this on the IACA discussion list and so forth. But anytime you're talking to an RMS vendor, if they don't have a solid answer for you about how you're going to get your own data out of the system in its original relational format, not some dumbed down single flat file that they give you or something like that, then you shouldn't go with that vendor. And we're seeing all of these cloud-based vendors coming out now that don't seem to have a good answer for how are you going to get the data out of the system if it's a cloud-based system. We can't do an ODBC link, so what is your solution otherwise? And there are good answers to that question. They're just not being given as far as I'm concerned.
It is interesting that they seem to spend a lot of time with getting the data in, but not too much time getting the data out.
I mean, RMS systems are developed to make it easy to find one report, basically. The report that you wrote last week that you can't find that matches these criteria. They're not meant for. They're not optimized for mass data analysis. Analysts need their own databases for that, and that means getting the data out of the record system. And just as we were getting there and finally getting agencies to understand the importance of allowing direct connections using ODBC technology to the back end, that technology is suddenly no longer available for the systems being sold today. So now we're going to have to fight to find another solution. Yeah. You can see why, leaving consulting was attractive to me. Having to fight all of these battles all the time.
Oh yeah,
in every new agency. I'd go to a new department, and you'd sit down with the analyst, and they'd say, "Oh, well, my IT department doesn't want me to have this," and then they won't let me install Access on my computer, and you just, I put my hands in front of my face and think, I don't know if I can do this again. This battle has already been fought too many times.
Yeah, I'm no stranger to fighting with the IT departments. That's for sure. And I was just thinking, too, to add to the fire that you just described, then trying to get one RMS from one department to communicate with another RMS from a different department. That's yeah.
Well, that's a big part of my life these days. I still have that contract with the Mass Gaming Commission, so I'm analyzing the impact of casinos on 3 areas of Massachusetts where they were built, and that involves integrating the RMS systems of the agencies in the surrounding area. I'm working with about 8 of them, and fortunately, thank God, the NIBRS standard poses some uniformity on the way data is collected, but it's a big task to try to get the data integrated from all of these different agencies.
So another question I wanted to ask you is there a product, whether it be a book, an article, a computer tool, maybe a class that you developed? What are you most proud of?
I am, that's a good question. For a while, I would have said my Microsoft Office book that I wrote with Mark Stallo back in the 2000s. I was very happy with the way that came out, and I heard from a lot of analysts who used it and learned a lot of techniques from it. It's inexcusable that I haven't updated it yet since 2007, and it's a perpetual item on my to-do list to do that. And I've been working on it this summer, so hopefully we're going to get a new one out soon. But I really liked that. I think we did the step-by-step instructions very well, and it helped get analysts a lot to the next level. But I would say more recently, for the series of workshops that I taught with chiefs and other law enforcement personnel for IACA about how to implement a good crime analysis program, we wrote a 50-step book. And I was inspired, of course, by Ron Clark and John X, 2 books on becoming a problem-solving crime analyst in X number of small steps.
Oh, okay.
And I thought that small step idea was a really good one. So I geared this book towards 50 steps towards developing an effective crime analysis unit, and I think it came out really well. I think that if agencies that use it can use it to develop really good strategic plans for the improvement or the new development of a crime analysis program. I was hoping BJA was going to publish it as a standalone publication, and they never did. And so I'm not really sure what the status of it is now. Now I'm not affiliated with IACA anymore. I can't make any promises on behalf of its availability, but I think maybe I just need to rewrite it enough that it's a new material so I can put it out there again to the community.
Well, let's take another quick break. And after the break, this time I want to get into IACA. So you're listening to Analyst Talk with Jason Elder. We'll be right back.
Hi, I'm Kyle Stoker, and I'm encouraging you to vote in the IACA elections. So it's a little bit of a confusing process, but between August and September, nominees need to get nominated. So there's a nomination process where they have to get 2% of the membership, and then voting actually starts on October 1st. So for the entire month of October, you have the opportunity to vote for your final candidate. So make sure you go to the IACA website and vote, because our membership has a voice in who leads the organization, and you want to make sure that your voice is heard. Thank you very much.
Hi, this is Angela Becker-Hines, and I just want to remind you to give yourself a break. As analysts, we strive to have all the officers in our department utilize our skills, and we typically want to be everything to everyone and do everything we can each day. But work is much more manageable and less stressful if you embrace the fact that it's okay to take some time for yourself, and maybe even to say no once in a while. In analysis and in life, you have to give yourself a break or you risk burning out, and then you're no good to anyone. So just remember, it's okay to give yourself a break.
Welcome back. Before the break, Christopher was talking to us about his different recommendations for aspiring or established analysts. We got talking freely to the point where we didn't get to what I intended to talk about during that segment, which was the IACA. So as I mentioned in the beginning, you've spent more than 15 years on the executive board with IACA. I guess because of COVID, the conference got canceled this year. It was It was going to be the 30th conference. So what does it mean to you that it got canceled?
Well, obviously I understand why it got canceled. There's no way we could have held it. So there's absolutely no criticism to be levied about that. It was inevitable the way everything's being canceled. And I got to say, I'm not even terribly optimistic for next year, which I think not having it 2 years in a row might be potentially devastating. But I don't see how things are going to have improved by the time that we have to start collecting registrations when, we can't still have any doubt about whether it's going to happen. I'm not on the board anymore, so none of this is my decision, but I'm still a bit pessimistic that we're going to have any conference season next year. And yeah, that's obviously too bad. I mean, that's what kept me motivated for 20 years in this field, going to conferences occasionally, seeing my friends. I am being able to make friends who lived all across the country and still getting to see them every few months at one event or another. As much as I liked crime analysis, it would have been just a very lonely experience without this professional community. And I don't know that I would have stayed in it as long as I had. So definitely it's too bad that it got canceled. And obviously we need to start exploring more opportunities for interaction, online until we can get together again in person. I think it's great that they're doing that virtual conference.
That's free, by the way.
It's free. Yeah. I think that part of me wants everything to be okay and for the field not to be too hurt by the lack of face-to-face training. But on the other hand, a perverse part of me hopes that the field is a little bit hurt by it, because that will justify what we've been saying all along, that you've got to get together in person, that we're social people, that online isn't a substitute for collecting in one place and spending 5 intense days focused on different techniques and concepts in crime analysis. So I guess it's a win-win, right? If we're able to move everything online, then we'll be able to continue to service our members and build the profession the way we need to. But if we're not able to, then it means that there's still some value in those in-person conferences, and we can go back to them with a renewed vigor when that option is finally available again.
Do you have any fond or funny memories of a conference that you've attended that you can share? You can share anything, actually. This is not for, this is explicit, so you can talk freely.
I don't even know where I get started answering a question like that. We'd have to take up the whole segment. I have nothing but fond memories of 20 years of IACA conferences. And, when I was actually involved, of course, on the board, it just got a lot more chaotic. We're a passionate profession. We are made up of people who like what they do, love what they do in many cases, care about what they do, believe strongly in what they do, want to get better, ambitious people in many cases. And that has led over the years to a lot of interesting dynamics that, of course, always seem to come to head at a conference when you're all there together. So there have been lots of good times. There have been a lot of stressful times. There have been a lot of fights. There's been a lot of joy, but I don't know how to answer it succinctly. I get to see most of the great cities of the United States and many in the rest of the world because of the IACA and its conferences and events. I made the people who I consider my best friends and at those conferences. I had experiences that I'll never forget, and I think I became who I am at those events. I don't know. I think I just do it a disservice to try to pick out just one or two stories from the whole thing.
One thing I want to talk to you about the IACA and getting into more of a serious discussion is the potential of the association. It's $25 to join, and that's never gone up since, the association.
I fought to keep that where it was.
The association was what it is. Part of me feels that this is an association almost like a college club. It's just you pay your $25, you get it on a resume, and it just doesn't feel like a professional association. And in other ways, it has training, it has a conference. So it is a professional association. I don't want to sell it short, but I feel that it could potentially have so much bigger influence in law enforcement.
It has some places to go. There's no question about that. I would even agree that it has been stagnant for a while. And I don't say that in any way with trying to attach any blame to anybody, let alone the current board or any past boards. Certainly I was involved for, plenty of that time. So blame would be on me if nothing else. But I do think there's been a bit of stagnation for a while. And it all comes from the same thing. We're volunteers. The people that run the association, that do all the hard work, are people who are employed around the world at their agencies or for themselves and have plenty of work to do anyway, let alone the full-time job they take on when they decide to volunteer with the IACA. So there's only a certain amount you're going to get done in that situation. And I think, I worked, as I've said, a number of years with Analysts, which is a much smaller association when it comes to the number of members. And they have a much smaller conference. And yet they have, or I don't know anymore, but at least the peak, they had about half a dozen full-time employees for the association. Oh, wow. And they were getting lots of government grants every year to run a variety of different training programs, and basically, I think, existing largely off the administrative portion of those grants and able to pay a staff. And I don't think there's any reason the IACA couldn't move to that. I think we've probably accomplished everything we can accomplish with volunteers and with a working board, that meaning a board that actually does most of the work of the association, with a couple of key exceptions. The board should be an administrative body that meets periodically and sets direction and policy for the association, but we need things like an executive director and an administrative assistant and a staff of people, I think, who should be paid, who do the majority of the work. Obviously, there's a limit to how much we can expand. We're crime analysts, right? There's only going to be a certain number of us in the world at any given time, and only a certain amount of demand for our services. So we're never going to be an association of 20,000 members who has a event as elaborate as, say, the IACP conference every year, but we certainly have the opportunity to get more influence than we are. And what I'd like to see from the IACA is for it to grow into an association that has more influence on the direction of the profession, because there's nobody else jumping in to step up and fill that role. So when it comes to what an analyst ought to be doing on a daily basis, we ought to play a similar role to, say, the American Medical Association and its standards and practices for doctors. We ought to get to the point where everybody who works as a crime analyst has some sort of certification through the IACA to prove that they've met a minimum acceptable standard. And I think that if we ever get to that point, then it might be that we can't grow anymore and we just continue to offer quality training every year. But right now, we have publications that come and go, that aren't updated all that often. We've got a fairly limited number of events, even before COVID. We've got a training series that I think is extremely valuable. And again, I don't want to seem like I'm criticizing it, because it's run by some fantastic people. Kyle Stoker is, I think, probably the number one volunteer for the IACA. He's been running the training series for over a decade now, and it's been consistently one of our most successful products. And yet, I think he'd even agree that we don't update the curriculums often enough. We haven't been all that innovative in the development of new classes. And it's just because the time isn't there. And, we've hit a wall in what we can expect volunteers to do. You think we get more volunteers, and we've tried that, but, there comes a point that you can't manage many more people than you're currently managing with the resources that you have. So I really do think some paid positions are the ultimate way to move forward.
Good. I appreciate that answer. That was a real answer, and I always like real answers. So thank you for that.
Sure.
So what do you think your legacy is with the association?
Well, part of me, I don't want to answer that question, because I don't want to think of myself as having a legacy yet. I'm still in my mid-40s. I think I can still say mid in that context. And I feel like I still have got a lot to give. And I'd like to think that maybe 20 years from now, I'll have a different feeling about what my legacy is. Yeah. But I guess I don't want to take any individual credit for anything the association has accomplished. Everything that I'm proud of that was done during any time I served on the board was done in a context of a lot of very active, energetic, passionate people. And I guess I think our most productive period was from around 2002 to 2007 or 8, maybe, is what I think of as sort of the highlight of it all. And we had people, Noah Fritz was president for a while during that. He had Susan Smith, who nobody ever accused of not having enough energy. Jerry Tallman, Carolyn Cassidy, Kim Hathaway was treasurer for a while, then Samantha Gwynn. Mary Garand was our first training director. Jim Mallard was on the website for almost 15 years, starting in that period. And that was the period in which the association really started to do something more than just have its annual conference. And that's not a criticism of the past board. I mean, they spent over a decade just getting the association up and running, and then, of course, adapting immediately to the internet era, which started only a couple of years after the IACA was founded. So I remember my first conference in Milwaukee. Mark Stalla was president, and he put the conference bill on his credit card.
Yeah, he talked about that.
Did he? I didn't know if he was going to be paid back for it. I mean, that's what they had to deal with. So that they did the best they could in the formative era. And I think that the board that I was part of, we can take credit for kicking it up a notch and maybe setting an expectation for more stuff. We came out with the book, we introduced the training series, we introduced a website with a lot more resources, we introduced webinars, I want to say 3 or 4 other, certification, of course, the certification program. So all of that happened during the period that I was vice president of administration and then president. And I think that right now, that's what I would say is my legacy, that I participated with that group of people in a series of projects that are now just a permanent part of the association, basically. They didn't all go, the way that I hoped that they would go. And there are things that I would like to see differently. But I think we have a lot to be proud of in what we accomplished and how we kicked it into the next level. And I just think that there's a place to do that again now with the current board.
I was just thinking, you said you still have some time left. You could go for the career Grand Slam. You could get secretary and treasurer and then hold every position on the executive board. You could do that.
There was actually a time that was my plan, I think. But to be honest, I don't think you should run for a position just for that reason. And if I ever ran for treasurer, I think it would just be for that reason, to have that complete, to be the only person that ever served in all the positions. I've never envied the treasurer of the association. That person has way too much to do. To ask, I mean, we're a $500,000 a year association these days, and to ask somebody to manage that as a volunteer is a little bit crazy. I know they've got some bookkeeping support, but it's still pretty crazy. And we're taking people who, historically, the person in that position hasn't necessarily had any experience, in particular being a treasurer. And given the amount of money that we're handling, that's just a little bit nuts. I'll tell you something, while we're talking about the association and opinions, I think the worst thing the IACA ever did the entire time that I was involved in terms of making an efficient, effective organization, the worst thing they ever did was pass a series of bylaw amendments, I think back in 2014, one of which staggered the election of the board members, so that instead of having the whole board elected in 1 year and then served together for 3 years, there's always somebody coming on and going off. And I understand the reasoning behind the people that advocated for that, to keep some sort of sense of continuity and so forth, but we never lacked for that anyway. And the fact is, the board is so much more effective when they see themselves as a unit and when they have a chance to work together for a dedicated period of time. This current system of somebody always coming and going means that you're always training somebody, you're always getting somebody up to speed. You don't have like a shared vision anymore of what the association is supposed to accomplish. And I feel like the 4 years that I was vice president of membership, just recently ending in December last year, I was just treading water the entire time. We never got together and talked about strategic plans, about long-term goals, about vision, because we were always inaugurating a new board member. So if I would love to see the association go back to the old way of electing the whole board all together at once and letting that board develop their own vision collectively for the association together.
Yeah, I remember it going to the conferences, and it was like it was the entire class that was elected, and they announced it during the week of the conference. So I remember the picture being taken of all the members that just got elected and having that be the cohort to move forward.
Yeah, and I think it was better. I don't have an opinion about whether it has to happen, before the conference. I think there's kind of a neat thing that we do now where people can come to the conference and then meet the candidates for the office and then vote, afterwards. So there's some benefit to that too. But definitely getting everybody together on at once, a major event. And I was president for 2 terms, and I knew that I had this board to work with for the next 3 years. And so you were reluctant to do something like, all right, well, I'm not getting along with this person, but I can just wait them out. I'll just wait until they leave, and hopefully I'll get along with the next person. You couldn't do that. You had to find a way to work with them, and I just think it was so much more productive, and it was a better experience for me as a board member. I never felt that I had the same connection, the same closeness with the people I served on more recently, just because they were always leaving.
And just a plug for this show, we are going to be producing candidate-specific episodes for the race that's coming up for Vice President of Admin.
Which, by the way, most important position, I think.
So we will be interviewing each candidate. Each candidate will get their own episode on the podcast, and we will be releasing them all at the same time to hopefully better inform the membership. And so I really encourage people to vote. October is the month to vote. You can vote anytime during the month of October. So please look for information coming out about the candidates. Look for our podcasts and vote in October, please. So let's finish up with some personal interests. You enjoy jazz music.
Very much.
Yeah. So how did you get into listening to jazz?
I have to credit the IACA with that one too, actually. I'd always been into older music, I guess, pretty much all my life. I never really, I listened to jazz on and off, but I never really had the understanding of it. I first visited New Orleans in 2005, I think it was, when the board went down there to scout a couple of hotels for the conference that we ultimately had in 2006. It was the number one experience of my life. Other than meeting my wife, I'd have to say that visit had more to do with the rest of my life than anything else.
Nice.
There's some things I won't get into, but and not because anything in particular happened that time, but just because it was my first time in New Orleans, and I realized how much I loved the city, and it still is my favorite city in the world, largely because of its jazz history. I was exposed to traditional New Orleans jazz for the first time. I wandered into the club that would become my constant haunt for the next 15 years on that trip. There are around the country every year a number of jazz festivals. There are a couple of dozen, even just focusing on traditional jazz, and it's become kind of a hobby of mine to try to hit as many as possible. And my wife has actually gotten really involved in it. She wasn't at first, but she took an interest in it, and now she and I read the Syncopated Times, which is a jazz publication, every month together, and we've been on a jazz cruise, and we go to jazz festivals, and so that's become a huge part of my life. I haven't been to New Orleans in forever, and it's starting to kill me. I literally think I'm kind of withering away from lack of exposure to the place. So as soon as I can travel again, I can bet that's where I'm going to be.
So for someone that's not familiar with jazz, I mean, how would you recommend they start listening to jazz?
Well, I'd start with the early recordings from the 1920s. Louis Armstrong, of course, is the example of a beautiful, brilliant jazz musician. And his Hot 5 and Hot 7 recordings from that period still are just incredible to listen to today. If anybody really wanted to get into it, I think what I would recommend is that you go on Amazon Prime and watch the Ken Burns jazz series, at least the first 3 or 4 episodes. And that takes you through the development of jazz from its New Orleans roots into the big band era and then the development of bebop. And that's where I kind of lose interest. I'm not a bebop person. I recognize the best of bebop, but I'm not. If you're not familiar, that's a genre of jazz that developed in the 40s and 50s and really sort of came to dominate the jazz. But I'm much more traditionalist. I like the New Orleans style and the Chicago style. So if you just watch the first few episodes, you'd get a really solid understanding of those styles, and as well as a list of artists that you might want to then start tracking down. But of course, the number one way to get into it would just be to go to New Orleans. And there's good jazz in a lot of cities, but in most cities, it's an effort. You've got to make a reservation at the club and then go there and maybe stay for a fixed amount of time. New Orleans remains the only city I know where there's going to be 8 or 9 clubs playing excellent jazz on any given night, and you can just wander in and out of the club, have a couple of drinks, and then go on and check the next one. And they'll be playing in a traditional style in most of them, so you can listen for the songs that you particularly like or styles that you particularly like and note the titles and then start look up some recordings of those. That might be the top way to get into it when, of course, we can start visiting places again, if that ever happens.
Your other interest right now, you can do, at least up
Yeah.
there in Maine, which is wildlife viewing. So what
That's
kind
a
of
relatively
animals?
recent one for me. I think it's something that again, I got into as something I could do more with my wife, because she's the only person I see these days. We live in a great state for natural beauty and for variety of animals. And I mean, I think we're by percentage the most heavily forested state in the country. We got a beautiful seacoast and a great national park. And so what I did was, this is a very me thing to do. When we first moved up here, is I actually made a master list of every animal that you can find in the state of Maine, excepting insects and fishes, but just about everything else. And then, trying to check them off one by one, basically. And so we go to parks and on special little safaris and so forth, where you can see moose and bear and try to find animals, birds. And so I just recently bought a house here. We were living in a condo for a while, but I've bought a place on the Penobscot River in Maine, which is a beautiful, wide river. And I've got just in my own yard a ton of things to look at. We have a bald eagle who comes by every once in a while, and owls and hawks and lots of smaller animals running around this ravine that's on my property that I like to look at from my office window. And then for the bigger things, we have to drive and go to other places. But it's a great hobby for the COVID era, because you don't have to get too close to a lot of other people and you're out in nature most of the time. I just love to see foxes and bears and deer and everything there is to see in their natural habitat.
Let's move on to our last segment, which is Words of the World. This is where I give the guests the final words. So Christopher, you can promote any idea that you want. But Christopher, what are your words to the world?
So I blew it because I offered them earlier. I had this whole thing that I'd written down, that I wanted to say about the opportunity for everybody to be a pioneer. So I guess I just reiterate that because I didn't have a better idea. That this field is one that's constantly in flux, that's constantly growing. And every year there's new technologies, new techniques, new crimes, new challenges in policing. And of course, we're crime analysts. We're part of a larger profession of policing and police science. And every year there are opportunities for everybody in this field to create something, create an idea, a model, a technique, a formula, a document, a file, to create something that other people will use, that will move other people forward, that might have your name attached to it in 20 years or so. That we're going to use the elder technique in order to forecast crime in this series, that kind of thing. There's a ton of opportunity for that in this field. The best minds in crime analysis, the most advanced people, the people that you come to, the new analysts come to a conference and absolutely revere, still haven't thought of 90% of what needs to be thought of in this field. And so everybody's got an opportunity to contribute something. Find what really interests you, whether it's something substantive like a particular emerging crime. Heck, I don't think we have a good handle on cryptocurrency theft in the crime analysis field. So there's an opportunity right there. Somebody could be the expert on that for our association for some upcoming conference. We don't have enough models for predictive analysis. We're relying too much on simple models that were created for other purposes by academics who were trying to monetize them. We need to make our own models, and there are predictive methodologies that need to be developed. We need a return to community policing, obviously, in this country. We might call it something else, but we need to return to those basic principles, and there's a huge role for crime analysis to play. We need more effective ways of disseminating information to our audience. That old bulletin that we spend so much time creating that has that really careful layout, nobody wants to read that anymore. They want information given to them in order and in a platform that they can read on their hand. And we don't have, as far as I know, terribly good examples of the best products for this new era. So there's a ton of opportunity for every one of the 4,000 members of the IACA to contribute something innovative, something pioneering to this field. And I just want to encourage you to find what that is for you and pursue it.
Well, very good. Well, I leave every guest with, you've given me just enough to talk bad about you later. But I appreciate your time, Christopher. Thank you so much for being on the show, and you be safe.
Well, thank you. It's been a pleasure, and what you're doing is exactly one of the things I'm talking about. You're using a modern technology to bring the word to other analysts and to put some life into this profession. So I really applaud it, and it's been an honor to be here.
Thank you for joining us today on Analyst Talk with Jason Elder. We hope you not only enjoyed the show, but also learned something new. For more information on our guests and information relating to today's topic, please visit our website at leapodcast.com. Special thanks to The Rough and Tumble for our theme song. For more of their music, you can visit their website at theroughandtumble.com. Also thanks to Kyle McMullen for our show logo. For more of his design, please visit his website at moderntype.com. The show is hosted, recorded, and edited by Jason Elder and written by me, Mindy. You can contact us both via the LEA Podcast website. Please join us again next time as we interview another expert in this great field.